The air in the Mercy General Emergency Department was a carefully curated soup of anxieties, a blend of antiseptic, floor wax, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood that never quite washed out of the grout. It was a kingdom of controlled chaos, ruled by the relentless hum of fluorescent lights and the polyphonic symphony of beeping monitors. For Alara Vance, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of quiet penance where the loudest sound was a call bell and the most dangerous weapon was a pointedly written reprimand. She sought the mundane, the predictable rhythm of civilian life, a thick blanket to smother the embers of a past that still glowed hot in the dark. She moved through this kingdom like a ghost, her presence barely registering. Her worn, navy blue scrubs seemed to hang on her frame, deliberately chosen a size too large to obscure the hard lines of a body forged in crucibles she no longer named. Her movements were slow, measured, each step a conscious effort to unlearn the economy of motion drilled into her soul. She placed her feet flatly, heel to toe, a clumsy shuffle that was the antithesis of the silent, rolling gait that had once carried her across shattered landscapes under hostile moons. To the bustling, self-important staff of the ER, she was simply Nurse Vance. Slow Vance. Quiet Vance. The one you gave the simple tasks to, like restocking glove dispensers or changing the paper on exam tables. Inside her head, it was a different world. The quiet hum of the lights was a data stream. The ER wasn't a room, it was a tactical space. She noted the two main entrances, the single, smaller exit through the ambulance bay, the lack of viable cover between triage and the trauma base. The crash cart was poorly positioned, creating a bottleneck. The security guard near the entrance was overweight, his posture lazy, his hand resting nowhere near his sidearm. He was a vulnerability, not an asset. This constant, silent assessment was a reflex, a mental tick she couldn't erase, like a phantom limb that still ached with the memory of holding a rifle. A sudden clang of a dropped bedpan sent a jolt through her, not of surprise, but of pure, conditioned response. Her eyes flickered, her senses instantly cataloging the sound, its origin, its potential threat, before she consciously forced the reaction down, burying it under the heavy sedation of her chosen anonymity. The memory that surfaced was sharp and unwelcome. The metallic shriek of shrapnel against the armored hull of a striker, the smell of ozone and burnt hair. Kandahar. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, the image dissolving back into the sterile white of the ER walls. Vance. The voice was a whip crack of irritation, slicing through the ER's ambient noise. Dr. Mark Thorne, head of emergency medicine, stood with his arms crossed, his expensive Italian shoes tapping an impatient rhythm on the linoleum. He was a man built from confidence and cologne, a walking monument to the authority vested in him by a framed degree and a well-tailored lab coat. His power was purely institutional, a title he wore like a general's uniform, and he demanded the deference that came with it. Are you going to stand there all day, or are you planning on getting that saline drip for bed for? He snapped, his voice loud enough for half the staff to hear. The patient isn't getting any less dehydrated while you're daydreaming. Alara blinked, her face a carefully constructed mask of mild confusion. She turned slowly, her movements deliberately hesitant. Yes, doctor. Right away. Her voice was soft, flat, devoid of inflection. It was the voice she had practiced, the voice of someone who didn't want to be noticed, who wouldn't argue, who would simply comply. She shuffled toward the supply closet, her eyes fixed on the floor. Thorne watched her go, a sneer twisting his lips. He turned to Jenna, a young, eager nurse barely a year out of school, and said in a stage whisper, "It's like watching a sloth try to solve a geometry problem. I don't know how she passed her boards." Jenna offered a weak, uncomfortable smile. She felt a pang of sympathy for the quiet nurse, but Dr. Thorne was the boss. Challenging him was career suicide, so she just nodded and busied herself with a chart, ignoring the heat that crept up her neck. Inside the supply closet, surrounded by the clean scent of sterile gauze and iodine, Alara leaned her forehead against the cool metal of a shelf. She didn't feel anger. Anger was a luxury, a hot emotion that could compromise discipline. What she felt was a deep, resonant weariness. This was the price of peace. The daily, grinding humiliation was the toll she had to pay to live a life where no one shot at her. She took a slow, measured breath in through her nose for 4 seconds, held it for 4, and exhaled through her mouth for 4. Box breathing, a simple technique to lower the heart rate, to calm the sympathetic nervous system, to put the predator back in its cage. The memory it suppressed this time was of a dusty room in Fallujah, the coppery scent of blood so thick it was a taste, her hands working desperately to clamp a severed artery on a boy whose name she never learned. The pressure inside her chest was immense, a physical weight. It was the pressure of a life held in, of a warrior forced into the role of a servant. She grabbed the saline bag, her knuckles brushing against the shelf. The skin there was thick and ridged with pale, old scars. A roadmap of violent encounters her current persona was meant to deny. She flexed her fingers, the ghosts of old powers stirring within them, and then forced them to relax, to once again become the fumbling, uncertain hands of just a nurse. The days bled into one another, each a fresh layer of quiet indignities. Thorne seemed to take a special, perverse pleasure in targeting Alara. He assigned her to clean bedpans for cantankerous patients, to transport non-critical cases to distant wings of the hospital, to perform endless inventory checks that were well below her pay grade. He would forget to sign off on her hours, forcing her to track him down and ask meekly for his signature. He would interrupt her while she was talking to a patient, waving a dismissive hand and saying, "Let me handle this, nurse. We don't want to confuse them." Each slight was a small stone dropped into a deep well inside her. She absorbed them all with the same placid, maddeningly neutral expression. Her silence only seemed to enrage him further. He craved a reaction, a spark of defiance he could crush. He found his opportunity one Tuesday afternoon. Alara had been tending to a pair of young men in beds 6 and 7, both soldiers from the nearby army base who'd been in a minor car accident. They were loud, full of bravado, and relentlessly flirted with Jenna. They mostly ignored Alara, who moved with her usual quiet slowness, checking their vitals and adjusting their pillows. One of them, a corporal with a fresh cast on his arm, watched her try to adjust his foredrip. Her fingers seemed to fumble with the dial. "Easy there, ma'am," he said, a teasing grin on his face. "Don't want to blow a gasket." His friend in the next bed laughed. "Give her a break, Miller. She's doing her best." The condescension was casual, unthinking. Alara didn't respond. She just nodded, finished the adjustment, and made a note on the chart. Internally, she cataloged their injuries with practiced ease. Hairline fracture of the ulna, minor contusions, probable mild concussion on the second soldier. Vitals were stable. They were fine. They were children playing at being men, just as she had been once. Thorne strode over, having overheard the exchange. He saw his chance for a public lesson. "Vance, what did I tell you about double-checking your work?" he said, his voice ringing with false authority. He snatched the chart from her hands. He scanned it, looking for an error, any small mistake he could inflate into a major failing. He found nothing. The charting was meticulous, precise. It was annoyingly perfect. His frustration mounted. "Your handwriting is atrocious," he finally declared, pointing to her neat, compact block lettering. "It's barely legible. Do it again. And when you're done with that, the toilets in the staff locker room need a good scrub. I want to be able to see my reflection in them." The two soldiers fell silent, their teasing smiles vanishing. Even they could recognize the cruelty in the order. It was a deliberate, public humiliation. Jenna, who was nearby, looked down at her shoes, her face burning with secondhand shame. The entire art seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Alara to finally break, to cry, to yell, to do anything. Alara simply took the chart back from his hand. Her eyes were placid, her face unreadable. "Understood, doctor." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her pace as measured and slow as ever. As she passed the supply closet, she paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. For a single, terrifying moment, Jenna thought she saw something shift in the quiet nurse's posture. A flicker of tension in her shoulders, a hardening of her jaw. It was like watching a placid lake freeze over in an instant, the surface turning to hard, dangerous ice. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. She disappeared into the closet, and the moment passed. The weight inside Alara was becoming unbearable. The wall she had built around her past, brick by painful brick, was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of Thorne's petty tyranny. The memories were leaking through. The smell of the industrial-strength bathroom cleaner reminded her of the decontaminating agents used after a chemical exposure drill. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor would morph, for a split second, into the urgent ping of a targeting system locking on. She found herself clenching her fists in her pockets, her short, clean fingernails digging into her palms. She was here for atonement, to live a life so small and quiet it might balance the scales of her past. But the cost was proving higher than she had anticipated. She was a weapon locked in a safety deposit box, and the constant rattling from the outside was making the trigger mechanism itch. The breaking point arrived not with a whimper, but with a screech. It was the sound of the dedicated code black alarm, a piercing, multi-tone shriek reserved for the absolute worst-case scenarios. It was a sound that cut through the mundane chatter of the ER and grabbed everyone by the spine. Every head snapped up. Every conversation died. A frantic voice crackled over the intercom, strained with panic. Code Black. Mass casualty incident. Active shooter reported at the downtown transit center. Multiple gunshot victims inbound. Repeat. Code Black. All hands on deck. For a heartbeat, the ER was frozen, a tableau of shock. Then, chaos erupted. It was a flash flood of panic. Nurses scrambled, doctors shouted, and the carefully controlled environment of Mercy General disintegrated into a maelstrom of fear and confusion. Dr. Thorne, the self-proclaimed king of this little kingdom, was the first to break. His face went chalk white, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. His hands, which had been so steady when pointing out a non-existent charting error, now trembled violently. Get trauma bays 1 through 4 prepped. Now, he yelled, his voice a high-pitched squeal. Someone call the on-call surgeons. Where are the Oneg blood packs? Why isn't anyone moving? His orders were a shotgun blast of panic, superficial and contradictory. He was flitting from station to station, a panicked bird trapped in a cage, his presence only adding to the confusion. He tried to pull on a pair of sterile gloves and fumbled them, dropping one on the floor. He swore, his face slick with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights. The symphony of crisis had begun, and its conductor had lost his mind. But for Alara Vance, something else was happening. As the wave of chaos washed over the room, the immense, crushing pressure that had been sitting on her chest for months simply evaporated. The noise, the shouting, the fear, it all faded into a manageable, ambient static. The world, which had been a blurry mess of emotional and social complexities, suddenly snapped into sharp, crystalline focus. Her heart rate, which had been stubbornly elevated from Thorne's latest reprimand, didn't spike. It dropped. It settled into a slow, powerful metronomic rhythm. 60 beats per minute. Kumbakadam. The ghost in the machine woke up. The first wave of victims arrived, a torrent of blood and pain pushed through the ambulance bay doors by frantic paramedics. The air filled with screams, the metallic smell of fresh blood, and the ozone scent of discharged firearms that clung to the victim's clothing. Thorne was standing over the first gurney, a police officer with a sucking chest wound. The officer was gasping, his face a terrifying shade of blue, his eyes wide with the primal fear of suffocation. Thorne held a large-bore needle, his hand shaking so badly he couldn't possibly hope to find the correct intercostal space for a needle decompression. He was going to miss, to puncture a lung, to kill a man who could still be saved. Alara saw it all in a single, detached assessment. Trajectory of injury, cyanosis, jugular vein distension, classic tension pneumothorax. Time to definitive care, less than 60 seconds. probability of iatrogenic lung puncture by panicking physician, greater than 90%. The core of her being, the fundamental principle upon which her entire past life had been built, the preservation of life in the face of violent death, overrode every other directive. The mission to remain hidden was compromised. The mission to save the man on the gurney was absolute. She moved. Her clumsy shuffle was gone, replaced by a glide so swift and silent that no one noticed her until she was there. She placed a hand on Thorne's arm. Her touch was light, but the strength behind it was immovable. "Stop," she said. The word was not loud. It was not a plea. It was a flat, cold, absolute command. It cut through Thorne's panic like a scalpel. He looked at her, his eyes wild. "Vance, get out of my way. This man is dying." "You are going to kill him," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Her eyes were no longer downcast. They were locked on his, and the meek, hesitant nurse was gone. In her place was something ancient and dangerous. "Let go of the needle. Insubordination. I'll have your job for this," he shrieked, trying to wrench his arm free. Alara didn't argue. She simply tightened her grip. Her fingers, no longer faking weakness, felt like steel bands around his wrist. With her other hand, she plucked the needle from his grasp with surgical precision. She pushed him, not violently, but with an irresistible, perfectly balanced force that sent him stumbling back a step. In that moment, the mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The apologetic stoop in her shoulders snapped straight, her spine locking into a ramrod posture of pure command. Her face, once a placid pool, became a mask of cold, analytical focus. The voice that came from her next was an octave lower, a rasp of authority that had once commanded hardened soldiers in the heart of a firefight. "Jenna," she barked, not looking away from the dying officer. "Give me a chest tube tray and a full trauma panel." Now, Jenna, who had been frozen in indecision, stared at her. She saw the panicked, useless chief of ER on one side, and on the other, a woman she didn't recognize. This new Alara was terrifying, but she radiated a competence that was as palpable as a magnetic field. Jenna didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am," she said, the honorific slipping out unconsciously, and she ran. She had made her choice. She was following the one who knew what to do. Alara turned her full attention to the patient. Her hands moved with a blur of practiced, lethal efficiency. She located the second intercostal space in the midclavicular line with 2 fingers. There was no hesitation. The needle plunged into the officer's chest. A loud hiss of escaping air filled the space, and the man on the gurney took a deep, shuddering gasp. Color began to flood back into his face. The whole procedure took less than 3 seconds. She didn't pause to admire her work. She was already moving, her eyes scanning the chaotic room, her mind a tactical computer processing dozens of data streams at once. "You," she snapped, pointing at a stunned resident. "That man has a femoral bleed. Get above the wound and put all your weight on that artery. Don't let up until I tell you to. You too," she pointed to a pair of orderlies. "Get every gurney out of the central aisle. I need a clear path. Go." People moved. The force of her command was absolute, undeniable. She was the calm eye at the center of the hurricane, and her will was bending the storm around her. She arrived at the gurney of Corporal Miller, the soldier who had been teasing her just an hour earlier. A piece of shrapnel from whatever had happened to the transit center had torn through his side, and he was bleeding out, his bravado gone, replaced by the pale, clammy look of shock. His friend in the next bed was screaming his name. "Stay with me, Corporal," Alara said, her voice low and even as her hands flew over his body, assessing the damage. The wound was high on his thigh, near the groin, in a place where a standard tourniquet would be ineffective. She ripped open a packet of hemostatic gauze. "I need pressure," she said to no one in particular. Jenna was instantly at her side. "Pack this wound. Hard. Shove it in as deep as you can." Jenna's hands were shaking, but she did as she was told. Alara was already working on the corporal's airway, ensuring it was clear. She grabbed an IO drill from the crash cart Jenna had brought. Without breaking stride, She located the tibial plateau on the corporal's leg and, with a grimace of focused effort, drilled the needle directly into the bone marrow. It was a brutal, effective military technique for gaining vascular access when peripheral veins had collapsed. Most civilian nurses had only ever read about it. The two wounded veterans, Miller and his friend, watched her. Their teasing grins were long gone, replaced by expressions of pure, unadulterated awe. They were soldiers. They knew the movements. They recognized the economy of motion, the brutal efficiency, the absolute calm under fire. This wasn't a nurse. This was a warrior. They were watching a ghost from their world, a legend made flesh, a top-tier combat medic doing her bloody, beautiful work. Miller's friend stopped screaming and just stared, his mouth agape. He had seen medics work in the field, but he had never seen anything like this. This was a masterclass in controlled violence, all of it directed at saving a life. Thorne, meanwhile, had been rendered completely irrelevant. He stood on the periphery, sputtering about protocols and reporting her to the board. This is unauthorized. You can't just drill into a man's bone. That's not procedure. Alara didn't even glance at him. She was already moving to the next patient, a woman with a gunshot wound to the abdomen. She was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of survival, and Thorne was just a discordant noise in the background. The staff, from the senior residents to the junior nurses, now orbited her entirely. They bypassed Thorne, bringing her status reports, asking for her orders. They had seen true competence, and the flimsy authority of a title meant nothing next to it. In the space of 5 minutes, Alara Vance had performed a coup, not through force of arms, but through sheer, undeniable skill. The ER was now her territory. Over the next hour, Alara didn't stop. She directed the flow of patients, triaging with a speed and accuracy that was breathtaking. She diagnosed a pericardial tamponade by sight and guided a young surgeon through his first pericardiocentesis. She set up a walking blood bank using the uninjured staff with O-negative blood, another field technique. She manually clamped a bleeding artery inside a patient's wound with her own hand, holding it for 10 agonizing minutes until a surgeon was free to take over. Her scrubs were soaked in the blood of half a dozen strangers. Her face was a grim mask of concentration. She was no longer Alara Vance, the quiet nurse. She was Master Sergeant Vance, call sign Ghost, and she was at war. Slowly, painstakingly, order was forged from chaos. The screaming subsided, replaced by the organized hum of a functioning trauma center. Patients were stabilized. The most critical were sent up to surgery. The tide of blood and death had been stemmed, held back by the will of one woman. As the last critical patient was wheeled out, a profound quiet fell over the ER. It was the silence of exhaustion, of shock, of awe. The staff stood amidst the debris of their battle, blood-soaked gauze, discarded wrappers, empty saline bags, and stared at Alara. She stood in the center of the room, breathing slowly, her posture finally relaxing slightly. She looked down at her hands, covered in drying blood, and for the first time, a flicker of the old weariness returned to her eyes. The wall was down. The ghost was out. She wasn't sure she could ever put it back. That was when Thorne saw his moment to reclaim his kingdom. He strode into the center of the room, his face a thunderous mask of self-righteous fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Alara. He spat, his voice trembling with rage. You are finished. I am firing you, and I am personally reporting you to the state nursing board. I will see to it that you never work in a hospital again. What you did here was reckless, insubordinate, and a complete violation of every protocol we have. Alara looked at him. She didn't flinch. She just held his gaze with her flat, tired eyes. She was too exhausted to even form a defense. Let him do it. Maybe it was for the best. Before she could speak, the main doors to the ER swished open with a pneumatic hiss. The sound was jarring in the sudden quiet. 2 figures entered, followed by a pair of armed men in the dark, severe uniforms of military police. The first figure was a woman. She was tall, with sharp features and silvering hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore the immaculate dress uniform of a United States Army colonel, her chest a constellation of ribbons and medals that spoke of a long and storied career. Her presence radiated an authority that made Thorne's manufactured bluster seem like a child's tantrum. The entire room seemed to snap to attention. The colonel's eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the room, taking in the carnage, the exhausted staff, and finally, they landed on Alara. A flicker of something, recognition, relief, grim understanding, passed across her features. Thorne, seeing a higher authority he could appeal to, puffed out his chest and marched toward her. "Colonel, I am Dr. Thorne, head of this department. I must insist that you have this woman arrested. She has assaulted me, ignored direct orders, and performed dangerous, unsanctioned procedures on multiple patients, including 2 of your own men." The colonel did not look at him. She walked right past him as if he were a piece of furniture, her gaze fixed entirely on Alara. The armed men flanking her subtly shifted, placing themselves between her and Thorne, a silent, intimidating barrier. She stopped a few feet from Alara. She looked at the blood covering Alara's scrubs, at the exhaustion etched on her face, at the profound stillness that had settled over her. "Vance," the colonel said, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. It was not a question. It was a statement. Alara gave a slow, tired nod. "Colonel Rostova." Colonel Rostova's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "I was told I might find you here. Your file was flagged when Corporal Miller's chart was uploaded. I owe access. Combat tourniquet. They don't teach those techniques to civilian nurses." She gestured vaguely at the room. "Looks like you've been busy." Thorne, ignored and incensed, tried again. "Colonel, I demand an explanation. This nurse is a liability." This time, Rostova turned her head slowly, fixing him with a gaze so cold it could have frozen boiling water. "You are Dr. Thorne?" "Yes, and I am in charge here." "No, doctor," Rostova said, her voice dangerously soft. "You are not. You are merely the man with the title." She turned her gaze to the rest of the stunned staff, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "For those of you who do not know, this is not Nurse Vance. This is retired Master Sergeant Alara Vance, former senior medic for a Tier 1 unit within the Joint Special Operations Command." A collective gasp went through the room. Jenna's hand flew to her mouth. The pieces clicked into place, the speed, the calm, the brutal efficiency. Rostova continued, her eyes boring into Thorne's. "Master Sergeant Vance has more hours of trauma care experience in active combat zones than every single person in this room combined. She is a recipient of the Bronze Star with valor for running through enemy fire to treat a dozen wounded men. She personally field-tested and helped write the manual on TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, that is now the standard for every special operator in the United States military. The unsanctioned procedures she performed tonight are the reason you don't have a dozen more bodies on their way to your morgue." She took a step closer to Thorne, who was now visibly shrinking. "I have already reviewed the security footage, and I have spoken to Corporal Miller and his specialist. They both attest that you froze, that you were about to make a fatal error, and that you actively interfere with Master Sergeant Vance while she was saving their lives. Your incompetence and your arrogance nearly cost my men everything." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the suffocating silence. "Consider your position at this hospital terminated, effective immediately. Your medical license will be under formal review by a board that will include representatives from the Department of Defense. You will be hearing from our lawyers regarding your criminal negligence." "Security," she said, nodding to the hospital's own guards who had been watching, wide-eyed, from the entrance. "Please escort this man off the premises." Thorne stood, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. His face was a mottled canvas of red and white. Stripped of his title, his authority, he was nothing. He was just a small, terrified man who had been utterly and publicly broken. The security guards took him by the arms, and he went without a fight, a hollowed-out shell of his former arrogance. The ER was silent again. Rostova turned back to Alara. Her expression was all business now, but laced with a deep, unspoken respect. "It's good to see you, Ghost," she said, using the old call sign. "You too, Eva," Alara whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so long. "We have a situation," Rostova said, getting straight to the point. "A bad one. A diplomatic convoy was hit in North Africa. We have survivors, but they're pinned down in a non-permissive environment. The local medical facilities aren't equipped to handle them, and our near-surgical team is 6 hours out." Alara closed her eyes. She had tried so hard to leave this world behind. She had sought out the quiet, the anonymous, the mundane. But the world, it seemed, was not done with her. She looked around the ER, at Jenna, who was watching her with something akin to hero worship, at the other nurses and doctors who were looking at her with newfound respect, at the stabilized patients who were alive because of her. Her penance wasn't in hiding. It was in using the skills that had cost her so much. "They need a medic who can stabilize them for extraction," Rostova finished. "They need the best. They need you." Alara opened her eyes. The weariness was still there, a deep ache in her bones, but it was now overlaid with something else. Purpose. The mask was gone. The ghost was free. There was no going back. She gave a single, sharp nod. "When do we leave?" Rostova's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "Now." She pointed toward the ceiling. "Choppers on the roof." Without another word, Alara Vance turned and walked toward the exit, her stride no longer the hesitant shuffle of a meek nurse, but the long, confident, rolling gait of a warrior heading back to the fight. She didn't look back. The staff of Mercy General watched her go, silent and awestruck, forever changed by the day the quiet, clumsy nurse they had mocked revealed herself to be a legend. They had thought she was just a nurse. They were wrong. She was a storm, and she had just been unleashed.